seemed appropriate to hold the first, Beers with Engineers session on a St. Patrick's Day. It just means that, my first choice for beer for this session is going to have to be Guinness. So, which could be worse. And of course, with a name like Gallagher, I have to have an Irish pub mug. So that's a requirement for today. All right. So we'll go ahead and get the party started here. Welcome to the first installment of the Cloud Native Beers with Engineers. We're really excited about this series and really looking forward to connecting with everybody to really talk about and understand where you are in your cloud native journey today and how you're utilizing ServiceNow to help kind of manage and drive that cloud native journey, and how we can continue to drive that and help enable the capabilities within ServiceNow to help you continue to move forward along that journey. So, just really quickly, we'll start off with just a real high level agenda and a couple of housekeeping items, and then we'll kind of dive into the main meat for the day. So, first of all, we're going to talk about why are we here, what are we doing. We talked a little bit about that. We'll dig in more. We'll introduce Will and myself, talk about our backgrounds a bit and why this is important to us. Then we'll go into our tech deep dive session for this month, which is around building a containerized MidServer and deploying it into Kubernetes infrastructure. And then we'll just open it up for some question and answers, right? Let's do a little workshopping. Let's talk about where you guys are at and what you're working on, and if you're having any challenges or any questions that you may have around this, this is the time and the place to do it. So, really key thing here is we'll just talk at a high level. Why are we here, right? So it's really to bring together and build a community of ServiceNow customers who are at a similar place in their cloud native journey, and then talk about how you're using ServiceNow to manage your cloud native technology portfolio. All right. And when we mean cloud native technology, that's really the cloud native computing foundation's definition of cloud native technology, right? This, we will at some point probably get into some serverless function conversations and microservices specifically. Today we're really focusing heavily on containerization and containerization of the MidServer itself. So with that, I'll kick off kind of the introductions of who we are and why we're here talking about it. So myself, Mike Gallagher, I am an architect in the commercial space in the technology workflows business unit here. My background, 25 plus years in technology. I tell everybody, if it runs ones and zeros, I've probably had a hand in it at some point, right? I've done everything from software development to database administration to, managing ops for a cloud provider here in Denver, to VMware TAM prior to coming here to ServiceNow. So I love technology. I tell everybody I have an invisible propeller, right? And I love using technology to solve business problems. A little bit of a side note, I am heavily invested in training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and playing board games with my family. Those are my big kind of side passions. Will, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name's Will. I've been with ServiceNow for about a year. Before that, most recently, I worked for 6 years with a ServiceNow customer, where I did a lot of cloudy things and automated a lot of cloud things using ServiceNow. I worked in one form of technology or the other for over 2 decades. And in my spare time, I enjoy hanging out with my family and playing recreational hockey.
Awesome. All right. So also really quickly before we jump into the deep dive, I'll end the poll and kind of share the results, right? So it, this is wonderful, right? Because we have a great mixture of folks who are, hey, we're looking at Kubernetes right now. We're learning a lot about Kubernetes. We're actively implementing things. And also, we have customers who are, kind of looking into, Kubernetes as an organization and also doing some experimentation. So this is perfect, right? This is exactly where we want to be. We want to have folks who have a kind of a mishmash of that experience and can help talk through where they're at in the journey for today and tomorrow, and help us really help you get better along that journey. So, you know who we are. You know what the goal of the series is, right? Now let's dive into the tech deep dive, right? so today we're going to be focusing in on deploying and building a containerized mid, right? This is something that, at least for me, has been kind of a pet project since day one when I started at ServiceNow, right? Kind of the first thing I did when I looked at a MidServer, I was like, man, I wonder if we could run that in a container, right? And now, starting in Rome, we now provide a Docker file for building out a container image of the MidServer. And now, in my blog post that I put out last month, I've talked a bit about how to use that, how to publish it into a container registry and get it in. That's a bit we'll work through today. And then Will just posted a blog post earlier today about how to put it into a CI/CD pipeline and have that automated build process, because Will's all about automate all the things. Right now, let's take it the next step and automate everything. So let's talk about why you would want to do this in the first place, right? So we don't at ServiceNow provide a pre-built container image, right? We provide the Docker file that says, here's how you go and build a Docker container of the MidServer, but we don't provide the pre-built image. There's a couple of reasons for that. If we provided the pre-built image, we would have to put it out in a container repository and make it publicly available, and that's yet another sort of management overhead on our part. But the other reason why we don't do that is this middle bullet point here. Many customers are very restrictive around, hey, you can't deploy stuff from any old container registry on the planet into our production Kubernetes infrastructure, right? So in a lot of cases, a lot of customers were saying, hey, we're going to have to go and build this ourselves and put it in our own container registry anyway. So why should we go through the extra effort? And then the other reason why to do the build, right, is to really ultimately putting it in a container and deploying that container inside of your Kubernetes infrastructure gives you the ability to discover your Kubernetes infrastructure with a very close proximity between the Kubernetes API that we're using to enumerate all the resources in the Kubernetes cluster, and also it's long term will dramatically simplify the authorization and authentication process between the MidServer discovery process and the Kubernetes cluster. It's generally kind of a best practice. That way, then you also don't have to expose your API endpoint to external traffic for us to do discovery, because the MidServer is living inside of the Kubernetes cluster itself. So, thanks for jumping in on the chat. I forgot a couple of quick things. Feel free to use the Q&A if you have questions. Feel free to drop questions in chat. If you want to, you can raise your hand. We can have you come off mute and ask questions. One quick important thing is this is really your time, so don't hesitate to dig in and ask questions at any point. So let's talk about the process. How do we go about building out this container and deploying it into a Kubernetes cluster, right? So at a really high level, you build and publish the container image, which I'll show that process here. Generally, the recommended methodology is to then build a namespace dedicated to the ServiceNow components, so that way we can keep it all in that one kind of logical container. Then we build a secret that enables the MidServer to much more securely access the username and password that are being utilized for the MidServer to log into your ServiceNow instance. And then we configure a deployment manifest, which is a YAML file for deploying the container into the Kubernetes cluster. And then we actually deploy the MidServer and go through and validate that it's all there. So I'll actually kind of walk through that process right now and show you what that looks like, and then we'll go from there. So let me switch over to start off with. If you're not familiar, so Will posted a link in the chat, but definitely please go and look at the ServiceNow community. Both Will and I post blog articles on there fairly regularly, and there's a lot of great content in there as well. So definitely make sure you're checking in on that on a regular basis. So here is my new San Diego instance that I'm deploying my MidServer into. This is the nice new UI. If you haven't seen that yet, it's quite nice. So you'll see there's no MidServers deployed here yet today. So what I'll do is I'll go switch over to my terminal, my command line terminal, and what I'll do is I have in this directory, I have downloaded the Docker file that we have provided from ServiceNow. And if you want to get that link from the platform, you just go look for downloads, MidServer downloads. You'll see here's the Linux Docker recipe 64-bit. I just copy that URL here, go back here, and wget that URL. I won't re-download it and spend a bunch of time, but that's what we did. I downloaded that here, and then I use the Azure ACR, which is their container registry capability. So I've installed the Azure command line toolkit here, and then I say build the image. I want the image to be called the Kate's Mid, Kubernetes Mid, right? And I want it to be published into the registry called Kubernetes Mid, and I want you to use the documents in the local folder in order to build that. Sorry, I forgot to explain a step. You have to unzip that file first. Once you unzip the file, then you'll have the fully populated directory in order to do the build. So now if I hit that, we won't sit through the entire process. We can kind of look at and talk about a few things as it's going. But what that does is that takes all of the information that's provided in the Docker file about here's where to go get the various components in order to do this build. Here are all the things, and it's going to actually push it up into the Azure Container Registry, and it does the build on Azure's compute stack. It doesn't. I'm not doing any of the build locally here for a couple of reasons. One, some customers don't have access to Docker Desktop or the ability to run Docker to do builds locally on their machine. So I wanted to have something that's a little more kind of enterprise ready and use the Azure Container Registry. The other piece is this enables me to really do the build and the push kind of all in one command line, all in one go. So while that's going on there, in the background, I will show you the YAML file that I use in order to actually do this deployment. So it's pretty straightforward. In one file, what I'm doing is I'm building out the ServiceNow namespace, and then I'm deploying that MidServer into that ServiceNow namespace, and I'm telling it, hey, go and get this image that I just built, right? And this tag here, this latest, is saying, hey, go get the most recently built version of that container. And I'll show you on my Azure portal where to get that, right? So you go to the Azure Container Registry, which is this is the resource group that I've built. And then inside of this resource group, I have this Kate's Mid Container Registry. And then from there, each image that you build on the Azure side of the house is called a repository, right? So I've got this Kate's Mid repository here. And then here is the latest tag that I've built. And then this is the URL that you use to access that that built and published image once it's been pushed out into the registry. So let's go and check and see. It's probably complete by now. So what it's done is it's pushed everything up into the container registry, and now it's going through, and now it's actually downloading the additional components that are needed to be layered in on top of that container in order to get it built and up and running. So I already have one out there right now. So let's just go ahead and deploy this existing one, and then we can jump over to the CI/CD pipeline in the interest of time. So if my Kubernetes cluster wasn't already configured to connect to that container registry, I would have to run this command here to say, hey, I'm going to update my Kubernetes cluster called Kate's Autoscale that lives in the Kubernetes mid-testing resource group, and then I want to attach it to a container registry, and this is the container registry name that I would use. I've already run this for my Kubernetes cluster, and that takes about 5 to 10 minutes, so I'm not going to run this now live while everybody's watching. So, but if you don't already have that done, you'll need to provide that connectivity so that your Kubernetes cluster can pull stuff out of that container registry. But since that's already been completed, I'm going to go ahead and apply that YAML file. And what that's going to do is that's actually going to go out and create the namespace if it's not already there, and then it'll deploy the MidServer. There's a step in the middle where I have to create a secret to provide it the password, but I'm not going to do that with everyone there online now because it actually shows the password clear text when I build that secret. So I'm not going to share that as of today. That being said, it has now created that deployment, and then we'll go and see. So I have built that and put it into the ServiceNow deployment. It is currently in a container creating process, which means that it's actually trying to pull the container from the image registry. So it's okay. It's pulled it. It took about 24 seconds, and now it's up. It's running, and let's go back to my instance. And go find, actually we'll just go to history really quick, MidServers. So now it's up. It's up, it's deployed. And if we wanted to actually go and run discovery with this containerized MidServer, we'd have to go in there and we would have to go and validate that MidServer to make that as a viable option. Any questions about that? Comments, thoughts?
Q&A is all clear.
All right. Sounds good. So what I'll do is I'll stop sharing, and now let's go into phase 2, which is let's do the extra credit. Let's put it into a CI/CD pipeline and see how that works. So Will, why don't you talk about that, and then I'll stop sharing. You can walk through the process.
So when Mike's article in Community came out, I immediately jumped over there and started, following his instructions. And I kind of had two thoughts as I was going through the process. One was, this is really not too difficult. It's pretty straightforward, pretty cool. But then shortly thereafter, I thought to myself, well, do I want to do this a few times, a few times a week or maybe a few times a day if I'm really actively testing something. Not so much. So, a great way to automate repetitive build type activities is CI/CD. And so I've actually successfully put this process that Mike outlines in his blog article through a couple different standard CI/CD patterns. The first one I played with was Jenkins. Then I moved over to use the Amazon product, which is their whole code suite of tools: code commit, code build, code deploy. And what I found is that this process really fits into any CI/CD tool set with minimal heavy lifting. Where I finally settled was in Azure, because in my experience, if you've got to set up one MidServer, it's going to be a Windows box, just because everybody's got some Windows out there that they need to either discover or automate, or both. And that requires PowerShell. And today, if you want to do PowerShell things, you've got to have a Windows mid. Windows on Kubernetes is it's got some unique character traits, and so the easiest way to do that today is in Azure, because it's Microsoft. So Azure has a very slick implementation of CI/CD, which integrates quite readily with both their Kubernetes solution as well as GitHub, which is also owned by Microsoft. And I like storing my code on GitHub, so that kind of already gave me a leg up in terms of automating things. So let me go ahead and show you what that looks like. That's not the right screen.
I see ADO mid images.
You see a terminal window?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, Zoom's a little interesting with sharing. It's got the banner over on my other monitor. So I kind of picked up with the process Mike outlined right after we download that zip archive from our instance and then unzip it. So I'm in the directory that results when you unpack that zip file. And so then what I did was I just turned that into a Git repo and pushed it over to a project in GitHub. Then I created a brief YAML file, which is used by the Azure DevOps pipelines. It basically tells Azure DevOps what steps to perform to build your image. And it's pretty abbreviated. We tell it that we're going to use a Windows 2019 image as the basis. That's basically going to be the engine on which your build steps execute. And so similar to the need to have secrets stored within Kubernetes so that when your MidServer spins up, it can authenticate to your instance, I needed to create some similar constructs within my DevOps pipeline so that the build process could authenticate into the Azure container repository to be able to push that image up when it was done building. So in order to do that, I just use the built-in capability of Azure DevOps to store variables. So I created a little group named Docker vars, and it's just key value pairs. I've got my Azure Service Principal identification. That's in plain text. And then the things I don't want to be visible are stored as secret type values. And then I just plugged those in to my build instructions as needed. So for example, this step here authenticates the build process into the Azure Container Registry. And then I've got Docker secrets stored in there as well, just because I wanted to make this somewhat general purpose. And sometimes there are images which need to pull components from Docker Hub. So I just wanted to have that ability in my back pocket if I needed to pop it in there. In the case of building the Windows mid image, it pulls everything from the Microsoft container repository. So by doing this, what it provides a couple things. One is it essentially makes your MidServer configuration resident completely in code. So an example of that would be, in some cases, we need to, our documentation covers ways to tweak your MidServer configuration. Sometimes, depending on the workload that's on a MidServer, you need to increase the Java memory, for example. And for a traditional MidServer, that's accomplished by modifying the wrapper override file. And on a traditional server, it's easy, albeit tedious. You log into the server, you go to the appropriate directory, you edit the file, and then you bounce your mid service. When you're decoupling the mid service from an actual running server and you're running it as a container, you have to have a little more control and forethought into how you do that, because you can't just log into a container necessarily. So the way I did that was just navigating into the code. And so what I'm looking at now is part of the payload that's delivered by our Docker recipe that's downloaded off your instance. And so one of the files that it executes is an install. In this case, I'm still on the Windows image. So it's running an install PowerShell script. And then when I looked at that install PowerShell script, I can see that it's already got a line where it's modifying the wrapper params that are going into the MidServer config. And so all I did was I just added my own line to tweak the Java memory. And so now, because this image is being built as part of a CI/CD pipeline, all it takes to have that take effect is I just push this code up to GitHub, which then kicks off a build that will look like this. So this is just a build that ran, especially with Windows. The build does take, takes a few minutes. So I'm going to kind of do this cooking show style and show you what it looks like rather than have us all sit and watch the equivalent of paint dry. And so this is an example output of all the steps that are performed by the pipeline. And they're invoked automatically as soon as my modification to that Java settings is committed through, if you're talking about an enterprise environment, generally, code changes go through a standard review process and the code gets merged into the Git repository. At that point, it would automatically kick off a pipeline, similar to this, run through all the steps and then report success or failure at the end. And then one of the great things about Kubernetes is it's got resilience built into its DNA. So instead of having to kind of log into a Windows server and bounce a service, all you have to do to bounce your mid server is you just delete it. And then the mid server will reinstantiate. And if the image has changed in the meantime, it'll just pull that image down by default and immediately launch. And then you'll see it show up in your instance once it comes back online. Another benefit to incorporating this into the CI/CD pipeline is, as you may have experienced when you upgrade your instances or when your instances are patched, that comes with it a new new mid install payload. And traditionally, what will happen is when you start up a mid server and it calls up to an instance which is higher patch level, it'll automatically upgrade. So if you have kind of a static container image, which is not at the same patch level as your instance, then every time one of those starts up, it's going to take a little time to perform that upgrade process, during which it's not really usable as a mid server. So if the desire is to leverage this to provide a more elastic mid server infrastructure, say spin up a bunch of mid servers to do discovery during a particular window, and then decommission them, shut them down when the discovery is over, that startup delay which they would incur as part of doing that auto upgrade could potentially, that could be impactful. That could be suboptimal for the use case. And so by putting this into a CI/CD pipeline, it gives you the ability to just update the image kind of behind the scenes automatically, such that when you bounce your mid servers or when you spin up new mid servers, the patch levels just come up in sync automatically. You don't have that startup delay occurring. I think that about covers the CI/CD stuff. As Mike mentioned, there is a blog article out there. I put the link in chat, and would welcome any feedback on that, any further questions, or lessons learned that you folks encounter as you kind of start taking advantage of this new capability.
Excellent. So let's shift gears, and at this point, I'll go through and make sure everybody has the ability to unmute, because really the next phase here is for us to work through kind of Q&A and workshops, and any questions that you guys might have or might want to dig into, right? Do not hesitate to come off of mute. We'll just make sure everyone can. I'll just go through and give everyone the ability. Okay, so questions, thoughts, comments, anything that you'd like to share up to this point? Even unrelated to just the mid-server build.
Hey, I'm Jim Mackley here. On the mid-server and the cloud build, do you ever try to incorporate like a third-party vault system like CyberArk or HashiCorp? How would that work, or did you even try to play with that during your exercise there?
I actually did. When I did both the Jenkins and the Amazon code build approach, I stored the secrets in the AWS Secrets Manager.
Okay.
And so really all I had to do was just slightly modify the little build script so that it pulls, makes the appropriate API call, or CLI, runs the appropriate CLI command to pull the secret in and then pull it into an environment variable. I mean, that's the other nice thing about leveraging some of these build services, is because the build infrastructure is ephemeral. You don't have the same concern. Like, say you're doing a traditional Jenkins build, right? And it's a traditional kind of static Jenkins server, or even a Jenkins, agent that's out there running on a more permanent server. You've always got that nagging concern, right? That if somebody pops that server, they could observe, they could watch for process listings or interrogate the environment and potentially get secrets out of something while it's running. Whereas, using these build infrastructures where it's essentially containers under the covers that it's using, those are, very locked down. Nobody could log into those to like see what's going on. So storing, a secret briefly as an environment variable as part of a build pipeline is um, uh, much less of a concern than if you're doing it on a server that would otherwise be, open to SSH or RDP, even if it's only to support personnel.
Hold on, I
So,
want to
so
make sure
yeah, I
we're
mean,
answering the right
you can
question
you
though.
can plug it into, all these tools really are coming through with really good APIs, and it's
Okay.
really it's been quite refreshing how easily you can drop something like this into one of those tool sets, and from there on it's like lights out. You commit your change and then you just look for that green check mark to show you the build is completed versus having to go through a bunch of manual steps.
Yeah, that was my question. Are we talking about injecting the jar file for the credential resolver for the mid server to be able to connect into one of those credential repositories? Is that what the question was?
Oh, double muted. Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Okay. I have not played with that. That being said, though, I don't believe that would be terribly difficult, right? That would just need to be another layer in the Docker file where it would pull in that credential resolver and configure it on the mid server.
That's
Okay.
yeah, that's correct. The Docker file. So in the example I gave where I updated the Java memory settings, that was they already provided a hook to do that in the kind of out of the box PowerShell, install PowerShell scripts. But because we provide a Docker file, if you do have additional tweaks that you would normally do on a standalone server, pretty much any command that you would normally run manually, you can encapsulate into that Docker file, and it actually just does that as part of building it, so that you'll end up with a container image that has, the appropriately updated jar file if need be.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, so like here's the Docker file itself, right? And you'll notice it's just got some commands in here that says like, hey, you know, run this apt get, right? Or copy this thing from that thing. So I could easily see adding a section in here that just says, you know, kind of at the tail end here, right? you know, run wget and pull down that credential resolver jar file and put it in the appropriate spot. I have to admit I'm not super well versed on where that jar file goes, but I can easily see it. Hey, pull it down, drop it into the right place, and get it ready to go from the mid-server perspective, and then it would be right there as part of your CI/CD pipeline.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, no problem. Great question. Thank you, Jim. Oh, Tarshan says you also need the CyberArk agent in the container. Interesting.
So yeah, I mean, again, if it's, in whatever form that agent takes, if it's a tar archive or if it's a standard, if you're talking Linux, if it's like an RPM or a deb or an APT, as long as it's available to your build pipeline, you can incorporate that in the Docker file. If it does get a little more involved if you need to set up network ingress.
Yeah.
So, by default, outbound packets are generally not an issue. You saw, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, you didn't have to do anything special with your cluster to allow that outbound mid-server connectivity, nope. Right? To your
correct.
Just, yeah. Whereas if that agent needs to accept inbound connections, which I'm not familiar with that piece of the CyberArk architecture, so I don't know whether that's the case or not. If it's outbound, then other than putting the agent out there and ensuring that it's set to start up as needed as part of the Docker file would be all you need. If it does need to listen for, some centralized CyberArk, server to kind of reach into it, then that deployment YAML file that Mike went over might have to get updated to actually include like a service or an ingress that forwards. Basically, that just forwards that traffic from an external port that the Kubernetes cluster hosts, to the mid container, which will be listening on kind of an internal network on kind of a random ephemeral port number. But other than that, it's what Kubernetes is built to do. Honestly, it's just on the ingress side. It is, by default, it's kind of secure out of the box, so it doesn't open any ports. You have to specifically identify what ports you want to allow to come into, each container or each pod in Kubernetes parlance.
Yeah, and I was just looking here. Okay. Perfect. Thanks, Patrick. Please check the chat. We're gonna, in about the next 5 minutes or so, we're gonna kick off another poll. So please make sure you respond, because we're gonna randomly select somebody in that poll to donate $100 to the charity of their choice. So I'm just looking at the CyberArk install documents now, and it looks to me like it's an RPM, right? That you could just kind of download and install on that container image, and then configure it and get it up and running. Seems reasonable. Just need to add these commands into the Docker file in order to ensure that portion of it gets pulled in and built out. So other questions. Let me ask you, is anybody doing discovery of their Kubernetes infrastructure today? I think, Jim, you and I have talked about it in the past, right?
Yeah, we're in private cloud right now, but hope to go to public soon.
Yep. And we're seeing a lot of that.
So one of the things, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
We're discovering, I work for Jim. So we're discovering labels currently on the pods and services. We need to know if there's a way we could also discover the annotations.
I was just doing some work in the Kubernetes pattern today, and I did notice that it is querying annotations, but the specific thing I was looking at wasn't that, so I didn't really follow the thread. I will make a note to check on that.
It is collecting
what it does. I know it's querying them, but I don't know what it actually does with them after it pulls them in via the pattern.
So it pulls it in, but it's not populating those in the CMDB key value table. So looking at the pattern, it seems like it is being collected, but it is not being parsed and populated in the key value table.
Yep.
I've made a note to check on that. One thing I did notice is that sometimes the Kubernetes pattern needs a couple tweaks to get optimal behavior. For example, in a lot of my test environments, I noticed that out of the box, they would not come up discovering YAML files. So there's an extension that's part of the Kubernetes cluster pattern that pulls down deployments, daemon sets, stateful sets, and services in YAML form and stores them in the tracked config file table in your CMDB, which is I think it's really useful because it lets you hold two iterations on that YAML payload side by side and see exactly where they changed. And for whatever reason, sometimes that extension is not enabled when you first start using the Kubernetes pattern. So just as so I just turned that on, and then all of a sudden getting all this valuable insight into how the YAML content is changing on my cluster in those 4 areas. And then I've also played with extending that, and it's actually fairly straightforward to extend that to other Kubernetes objects which are of interest. So because of that, if you're not seeing the annotations come in, it could just be we need a little to dig into that. And it could just be something that's not, some step that's not turned on by default, or something of that nature that we need to tweak. I would say it's definitely worth making sure you're up to date with the latest store release of patterns, because especially in the Kubernetes area, I've noticed that they've made some significant improvements, like with the naming of the of those track YAML files, just from one dot release to another. So it's definitely worth making sure that you check the store periodically and see what the latest version of the patterns app is for pulling in your Kubernetes cluster stuff. But I will check on that and follow up with my findings.
All right. Another question there. So is there a better cleanup procedure, or is there any recommendation of a cleanup procedure?
By cleanup, you mean when stuff gets stale, like if a pod goes away?
Correct.
So what I saw was that pods that disappeared were getting cleaned up when I would rerun the schedule. I did have some isolated instances where that wasn't happening, which I attributed at the time to the fact that I'm running all kinds of different versions of the pattern because I'm doing a lot of testing. I'm in a lab environment primarily, as opposed to a more stable production, or even a real robust dev environment. So if you're seeing, are you seeing just nothing ever getting cleaned up right now, or is it
Correct.
just that you'll, okay.
Yeah, nothing's getting cleaned up for Docker containers and pods.
Right.
Pretty much everything, right? And even the new pods that got populated or containers that got populated had no status as well in there. So that was kind of a little shocking for me.
What do you know what version of the patterns you're currently running? If not off the top of your head, that's fine. If you want to follow up with an email, our emails are in the slide deck, which will get sent out if it hasn't already gone out. And let me know what version, then I can kind of dig into that a little more. Like I said, I have seen that, but when I went to kind of a pristine instance, put the latest patterns down there, and then ran deleted pods, and then reran the discovery, my experience was those things were getting cleaned up. So if you're having cleanup issues and you're at the latest patterns, then we may just need to open a support ticket, because my understanding is it should be cleaning up, when it discovers a pattern. When it discovers a cluster, if there are pods that are associated with that cluster in CMDB and they're no longer on the cluster, those pods, and then the kind of cascading down, down to the container image, that stuff should be getting cleaned up.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that's the standard behavior out of the box now, right? But I think...
Well, actually, let me just amend. I don't think they get deleted. They get marked as whatever it is, offline or retired or whatever. Yeah, we generally don't delete things from
exited.
CMDB.
I think they get marked as exited, but that's also, we were not seeing that all of them were marked exited. So, and we are at the latest pattern. I upgraded it to whatever the .87 latest one.
8.7. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll do some more testing on mine, and I'll kind of specifically spell out what I'm seeing, and then we can compare notes and determine whether you're seeing something different, or if what you're seeing matches what I'm seeing, but that's, leaving gaps for you, and then we can take it from there.
Sure. Sounds good. Thanks.
Yep. Great questions. Folks, we've got some more time here. Anybody else have questions? Anything they'd like us to cover really quickly? Okay, side note for me, was this the first time anybody has seen the San Diego UI?
Mike, do we need another poll?
Right, we should have. Another kind of fun one that I've been working on here. Let me show you this really quickly, since we're all here. Yeah. Yeah, John, it's a pretty big departure from where we've been. I'm very excited about kind of the future here. One of the things that I've been playing with, I just installed this, so there's not a lot of data yet, but is the new cloud operations workspace. So this is a newer kind of streamlined workspace to give you, kind of a snapshot of what's going on across discovery. So you can kind of jump in on, here's your cloud discovery pieces. Here's all your various schedules and, what errors they're running and those kinds of things. I'm really excited to see this kind of take shape and grow, because there's a lot of, the new UI has a lot of value, I think. So it's going to smooth things out for a lot of folks. Okay, so we have 5 minutes left. One other thing I did want to quickly kind of talk about is where we're going next month. So next month, today we talked about, hey, here's how you can build out a containerized MidServer. But now, as of San Diego, there's a new capability to automatically deploy and configure MidServers from kind of a template, essentially. So you will be able to say, hey, here's the YAML file for deploying MidServers in my Kubernetes environment. And then you'll be able to say, hey, I need 5 MidServers, go. And it'll go and deploy them all, and it'll get things up and validated using the mutual certificate validation, which I'm also really excited about. So in between now and then, we'll have a bit of a blog post to kind of talk about that and show how that works, but we'll also do some deep dive on it next month as well. You'll also be getting a poll here after the meeting closes to say, hey, what are the other things that you'd like us to dive into, right? Are there other topics that you'd like us to kind of like pick apart and get into? And then we can go dig in there and see what is most interesting for everybody else. We've got about 5 minutes left. Will, did you have anything else that you wanted to add before we close out?
I just had a follow-up question on the San Diego stuff. Mm-hmm. If I remember correctly, one of the kind of the big benefits to the template-based mid deployment is you can actually, with that, you can have the mid automatically validate. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
Okay.
Right. So, it uses the TLS-based mutual authentication between the MidServer and the ServiceNow instance. So as a result, it comes up automatically validated. There's some caveats to that. You won't be able to do configuration of the capabilities once it's up. You have to sort of define those capabilities at first, and then if you need to change those capabilities, you'll need to deploy again and retweak it. Thanks, Jim. Much appreciated. Excellent. Well, we'll give you guys 4 minutes back in your day. Have a phenomenal St. Patrick's Day, everyone. Make sure you go enjoy a frosty beverage. And we really, really are looking forward to seeing everyone here next month for the next session. We'll get invites out for that here shortly. Please, drag anybody and everyone who you think that this would be valuable for. We really want to make this as much of a cooperative community as possible. Excellent. Thanks, everyone. don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Thanks, Mike.